Before the debate is resumed on this bill, I remind the House that it has been agreed that a general debate be allowed covering this bill and the two related appropriation bills. And give the call to the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I held a Fisher budget forum a couple of months ago now, or a month ago, 6 weeks ago. It was obviously the second one that I'd held this year, and we, in my electorate, discussed the good, the bad and the ugly in Labor's 22-23 budget. Now, I think it's important to recognise where we've come from, and that is a position of strength that the coalition has set up the economy and handed the economy to the Labor government, which is an economy that was the envy of the world. Although the Labor government seem to be doing their best to trash that as we speak. Now, less than 6 months on, things are very, very different to where they were in May of this year. The Treasurer, Madam Deputy Speaker, promised a bread-and-butter budget, but now we know it was more like a charter boat budget. And any Queenslander that's listening to this would know what I mean by that, because the Treasurer is now wandering around saying, "Budget? What budget?" I've never seen a Treasurer or a government walk away from a much heralded budget as those opposite have done recently. But it's not all bad, and I do want to talk about some of the good things, because, as the Leader of the Opposition said, where we in opposition are not going to oppose for opposition's sake. Where there are good things in the budget, we'll identify that, we'll recognise that, and where there's bad things, bad policy that the government undertake, well, we'll call that out as well. I was pleased to see the childcare subsidy extended to even more Australians, and I had the shadow Minister for Early Childhood Education for an industry roundtable, and it was great to see and learn the perspectives of many industry players from the early childhood sector. And whilst I recognise and I acknowledge and it's a good thing that the childcare subsidy is being extended, what was made very clear to me, both in that meeting and since, has been that there are many childcare or early childhood centres operating around the country that, and in fact there are many places in the country that simply don't have access to those early childhood centres. So the government can throw all the money that it likes at this issue, but I know particularly in rural, remote and regional, some parts of regional Australia, there are young people who just simply cannot get those services. Families can't get those services. And what that means is that at least one parent will have to stay at home and look after those children. And obviously that has a significant impact on the productivity of this nation. I was also glad to see the government recommit to reducing the cost of medicines through the PBS co-payment, something which both parties took to the last election. I was especially pleased to see support for veterans' housing, with the $46.7 million investment into the Defence Home Ownership Assistance Scheme. Veterans' well-being has been one of my personal priorities over the last 6 years. There is so much more work to be done from this place for the care of our veterans. And last but not least, I want to once again put on the record the thanks of the people of the Sunshine Coast for the Labor government's intention to keep what we promised in the March budget, what the Coalition promised in the March budget of that $1.6 billion to invest in the Sunshine Coast Rail project. Now, I do want to say, whilst I'm very pleased to see that money, I'm very pleased to see the recognition from the minister that the money is in the budget, although it took a couple of days to get that announcement because there was nothing physically in the budget papers, which caused me some degree of consternation, as you'd probably imagine, Deputy Speaker. But the Infrastructure Minister, on about day 3 or 4 after the budget came out, and said that the Labor Party would be honouring the Coalition's commitment of $1.6 billion. So that's a great thing for the Sunshine Coast. We now have a bilateral or a bipartisan support for the Sunshine Coast Rail at a federal level. What we don't have on a $3.2 billion, estimated $3.2 billion project, is the state's $1.6 billion. Now, this is another example of an infrastructure project which we led from the front when we were in government. We led investing, or at least offering to invest, in a state project. When you've got a train, when you see a train in Queensland, Madam Deputy Speaker, that's operating on the North-South Railway line, you'll see it emblazoned with QR. You don't see CR, you don't see CTHR, you don't see Federal Rail. It says QR, Queensland Rail. And the Queensland State Government are responsible for its own rail line. But the federal member for Fairfax and I worked assiduously for 6 years with our own party, our own government, to get a commitment of $1.6 billion, and we secured that in the March budget. As I said, I'm very pleased to see that the Labor Party, the federal Labor Party, have come on board. It's a great project. It's a nation-building project. It's good for the economy. It's good for the local economy, and it's good for the environment. We need to get more cars off the road and more people into rail. But as I said, what we don't have is Queensland State Labor stumping up with their $1.6 billion. And it reminds me of the situation when, once again, we led the path. We trailblazed, the member for Fairfax and I, our funding commitment for the duplication of the North Coast Railway line. Now, that was not on the cards with the state government. Once again, QR project, Queensland Rail, but we offered to pay 50% of that project. We didn't have to put a cent towards it, just like we didn't need to put a cent towards the Sunshine Coast Rail. But the only way that we seem to be able to get the Queensland Labor State Government off their backsides and funding infrastructure in Queensland, particularly in areas like the Sunshine Coast, is if the federal government takes a leading role. Now, this is the member for Monash is looking at me, and I know exactly what he's thinking. He's thinking this is rewarding bad behaviour, member for Fisher, because that's exactly what we're doing. We are rewarding bad behaviour from a recalcitrant state government. The more money that we put in to Queensland on Queensland state government projects, the less money that they do. It's like rewarding a naughty child. What do? They keep doing it. They keep getting a reward. But if we didn't do that, the Queensland government would continue to not fund vital infrastructure projects. So it is a good thing that this Labor government stumped up and matched our funding, and I am, as is just about every person on the Sunshine Coast, very, very appreciative of it. Because not only will it provide a link between the Sunshine Coast coastal strip and Brisbane, it'll provide a vital link between the hinterland and the Sunshine Coast. It'll provide 9,550 jobs over the next 8 or so years. 9,550 jobs. It'll be the largest infrastructure project that the Sunshine Coast has ever seen. But what we don't have is the state government matching the federal government's commitment of their own $1.6 billion, to their eternal shame. We cannot host the Olympics in 2032, partly on the Sunshine Coast, if we do not have this rail done. And if the Queensland Government wants to look a gift horse in the mouth, whether it's a coalition gift horse or a Labor government gift horse, well, this rail line will go the way of the Redcliffe rail line, and it'll probably take another 100 years to be built. If we're going to build this rail line, it needs to be done before 2032. My best advice is it's going to take about 8 years to build it, coming from the Department of Transport in Queensland. So we have no time to spare. So get on with it, Mark Bailey, Transport Minister in Queensland. Stump up, come out, publicly say you're going to fund this $1.6 billion, and let's get on with it. The Caloundra Labor state member should also be voicing his support for this project, as should the Nicklin state Labor member. These two Labor state members have said nothing on this project whatsoever, and it's about time that, that they came out and publicly declared whether they are supportive of this project. If they're supportive, come out and support your communities. That's what your communities expect of an elected representative. Don't hide and wait until your government comes out and says what it's going to do. Be a leader. Push for change. Push the envelope, because that is what you are elected to do, whether it's in this place, whether it's in a state legislature or a council legislature. Push the envelope and stick up for your people. Madam Deputy Speaker, in relation to cost of living, which we heard so much about in the lead-up to this budget, I did my tour to Fisher, where I ride around my electorate, and I did 23 listening posts on my push bike, not my motorbike. I know you're thinking, did you do it on his motorbike or did you do it on his push bike? I did it on my push bike. I spoke to over 150 constituents in a week, and I was asked by a radio station whilst I was doing Tour de Fisher, what was the #1 burning issue from locals in Fisher? I'll tell you what the #1 burning issue was. Cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. It's all anybody wanted to talk about. And what we saw in the budget was discussion about reducing power prices. When they went to the election, of course, the Labor Party promised a $275 reduction in power prices. But when you dig into the budget papers, what we see is an acknowledgement from this Labor government that power prices are due to go up by 56% over the next 2 years, and gas prices are due to go up 44% over the next 2 years. Now, nowhere since the election has the Prime Minister repeated his commitment for a reduction in electricity prices. He talked about this on 97 occasions prior to the election, not once since. And his own budget papers, the government's own budget papers, demonstrate that power and gas are going to go up by, in power's sake, more than 50%, 66%, gas price 44%. We estimate that people in my electorate will be paying more than $2,000 by the end of Christmas, more than in their cost of living than what they would have been paying at the beginning of this year. This government needs to work with industry to reduce power prices. It's not just a matter of pushing more renewables into the market. It's a matter of sensibly balancing renewables and other forms of energy. By all means, look at nuclear energy, like the coalition government is doing. We're looking at nuclear energy. We're not demonising any form of energy because we need to be able to keep the lights on. And that is that is going to be, people are going to judge this government by how they manage their energy policy. And at the moment, as all our respective bills are showing, they are left wanting. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's some good things. There are certainly some bad things in this budget, and I'll continue to talk about them in this